Well, Depravity. And today's show is from Here to Depravity, where the quest for purity lost its way. Goodness, I'm tongue-tied today. And thanks to those of you who sent donations during the week, Lee, Ian, Jonathan, Richard, etc., for your support of the show. Thanks to everybody who hits the super chat today. The best way for me to see your comments is if you post a super chat or your questions for Mr. Jones today. And so post up your super chats if you'd like to ask a question during the show. Of course, Steve is really good at replying to emails, etc. Really interesting week, to say the least. All the stuff going on, all of the lies and spin going on. I posted something today about Nazi propaganda and how they use slogans to essentially control the population through emotion, and we see so much of that going on today. Just thought I would mention that. If people are interested, they can find that on my Facebook page. But so much propaganda going on out there, and even today's topic delves into propaganda in sort of a way because of the division between, well, what did you call it in your email here? Let me see if I can find that. You had said, let's see, where did it disappear to? Reality versus, where did it go? I know I had it here. Oh, goodness. I had it here just a little bit ago.
You want me to take over a little bit?
Yeah, sure. You go ahead.
Well, this discussion actually started as an email. And one of the listeners, let me read his quote. He's actually quoting from Carroll Quigley. I don't know if many people are aware of who Carroll Quigley was, but he was a Harvard historian that wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope.
And he was also Bill Clinton's professor at Georgetown.
Yeah. Well, and he's kind of quoted by a lot of liberals because they seem to think that admits to a conspiracy of some sorts. But that's not what we're really interested in here. Let me read the quote out of Tragedy and Hope. Opposed to this Western view of the world and the nature of man, there was from the beginning another opposed view of both, which receives its most explicit formulation by the Persian Zoroaster in the 7th century BC, and came into the Western tradition as a minor heretical theme. It came in through the Persian influence and the Hebrews, especially during the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, the 6th century BC, and it came in more fully through the Greek rationalist tradition from Pythagoras to Plato. This latter tradition encircled the early Christian religion, giving rise to many of the controversies that were settled in the early church councils, continuing on in the many heresies that extended through history from the Arians, the Manichaeans, Luther, Calvin, and the Jansenists. And the question goes on, explaining the difference between what Quigley calls a war between orthodoxy and Puritanism. And so what prodded this, I emailed him back, and I sent you a copy of the email on where the listener wanted this kind of explained. How does purity, an obsession with purity, end up corrupting society?
And how does it? How do we go from there?
Well, the way I see it is that there's really two strains that you have to kind of look at. One is the philosophical strain, and one's kind of the moral strain. I would go back to the beginning. Most scholars would say that the most important part of the Bible is the beginning of John, which unfortunately is poorly translated. As we know, we're fans of the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. Really should be translated, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Word was made sarx. Sarx is a word that really doesn't have a counterpart in English. It loosely means flesh, but it really means something very sinewy, bloody, almost a disgusting kind of reality. And so the word, I believe, was put in there specifically to challenge this idea of purity, that life could be this pure. achieve a pure life, just clean everything up. And so there's this idea that, which I think is very prevalent today, where you see, a form of iconoclasm reaping up again, where the early church had to contest the iconoclasts, which tried to get rid of all the icons, all the imagery, all the different realities of Christianity in favor for a pristine, sanitary type of religion, which is kind of what's going on today with the Marxist influence on society.
But in a sort of spun way, and you had written it. By the time of Christ, this debate evolved into a debate between truth, reality, morality versus dualism, solipsism, and liberality.
Right. I think what we have to do is, I've got a little quote here. There's in the church particularly, I don't know how other Logos teachers teach it, but the church kind of used to go back to an argument between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Parmenides, let me start with Heraclitus. If you look up the word logos, usually you'll find that it was a word coined by Heraclitus. Heraclitus was looking at a world of complete change, and he reasoned that in a world of complete change, there has to be some permanence of some sort. That permanence would have to be a kind of what Aristotle determined as the thing that kicked the universe off, the unmoved mover type thing. But on the other side of the argument was this Parmenides, whereas Heraclitus was portrayed as someone who believed everything was change. Parmenides believed, at least he's been portrayed as something that believed nothing changed. But I think we're kind of, this argument is kind of selling both sides short. So what I did way back is I tried to find the beginning of Logos doctrine. And I think if you really are honest about it, you'd have to say that the argument actually begins with a poem by Parmenides. And his poem is called The Way of Truth. Let me just read a portion of it very quickly. It is necessary to say and think that being is, nothingness is not. I order you to declare these things. In fact, you'll begin with this first way of inquiry. Avoid then that invented by mortals who know nothing, men with two truths. Uncertainty as fact guides in their hearts the wandering thought, and they are dragged stupid and all obtuse, astonished, confused by the races. For them, being and non-being are regarded as the same. Things and not are being the same thing. So what he's really, I think what you see here is the emergence of the twofold truth, where there's nothing to be distinguished between yes and no, being and not being. And it's envisioned, I think, what he's criticizing is these people envision this perfect world where there's no error and there's no falsity. And what he discovers is really the principle of non-contradiction, which we're all very aware of, is sort of the litmus test for understanding what truth is and what isn't truth.
Right. And under the trivium method studies, a contradiction is always, without exception, a lie or an error, and there are no contradictions in nature. And most people, when they see a contradiction, they throw their arms up in the air and they say, opinions are like expletive and you can't know the truth. Where in reality, if you grasp that a contradiction is a lie or an error, it tells you where to dig deeper until there are no more contradictions and until there's nothing left to no material, no general grammar, no who, what, where, and when to go through to find any more information that could invalidate or validate, as the case may be, the position. And when you have that epiphany or that aha moment, you've arrived at the point of truth where there are no more contradictions.
I would go back. Really, there's an argument whether Pythagoras or Plato came up with this, and it's the theory of, or the principle of non-contradiction. To me, is a little bit confusing for a lot of people. Usually, the argument I get is, well, you have white and black. What about gray? And that entirely misses the point. Most of my writings, I retranslated the principle of contradiction to simply be both sides of a contradiction cannot both be true.
Correct.
You kind of avoid all this stumbling spots. But the birth of philosophy really goes back to Plato. And Plato took all these principles of geometry and decided that by using geometry and measurements and numbers and that kind of thing, that he envisioned this perfect reality of being where there was, because numbers don't really have anything to do with meaning at all. So after he envisioned this, he envisioned, as I explained in the letter, a simple mathematical formula. If A equals B, B equals C, then A equals C. So Aristotle picked up on that and decided that he could do the same thing with Socrates and morality. So Socrates says if Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal type thing. But the detractors looked at, I believe, a writing by Plato where he starts looking at the absurdity of his own teaching and that it's leading to this idealized reality in the philosopher's mind. And so he writes what's arguably a tract that he's writing to the point of absurdity. But a lot of people have picked up on this and think that that's the side he advocated, was this idealized, that underneath reality, underneath everything that there is we should approach this thing of this one mind where reality is all illusion. We ourselves are kind of an illusion. We're just elements of this one mind thinking. And so you end up with modern philosophy after years and years and years where we're trying to recreate this sublime utopian thing, which can't be. It's argued against on every front.
And that's where people like Aldous Huxley, etc., come in promoting their dystopian utopia or whatever, and that's where Karl Marx stems out of. But I'm glad you brought up mathematics. Nearly a decade ago, and some of the listeners may remember this, it was one of the, well, not one of the first, it was episode number 111 and 112 of the LogosMedia podcast. I interviewed this guy, David Harriman, The Philosophic Corruption of Physics and the Logical Leap. And in it, and in his 11-hour, 12-hour, whatever it was, lecture, he goes in deep into explaining how philosophy got in and corrupted mathematics and all of this stuff. And then from there, we get quantum physics, which allows up to 12 contradictory views to be held at once. And he goes through and exposes all of this based on, who was it? I think it was Kant that he targeted as the main progenitor of these false ideas that seeped into mathematics.
Yeah. Well, Kant is kind of a controversial guy anyhow. There was a book on how the modern era was kind of developed by the Scots. But Kant was being argued against by Thomas Reid. And Kant sort of ends up being an enemy by all sides. He sort of gets everything wrong. What I find is that the whole idea of John's chapter on the Logos eventually gets picked up by the early Hermeticists, and they write it in the Corpus Hermeticum, where they again bring up this idea of this utopian ideal. And what makes it difficult, I think, for most people is that the utopian ideal has both moral implications, but it's a mathematical ideal. And we don't see that in this modern day. We've kind of eliminated the quest for meaning and most astronomers these days don't figure out cosmology with their telescopes. They do it with the slide rule on the computer. As that has been the evolution of science. The biggest problem, I think, though, is going back when you see what Quigley described as the Persian influence of dualism. You see that picked up again and again and again. In Christianity, the dualists at that time were called the Manichaeans, and they were sort of the Zoroastrian version of Christianity. What you can do is you can find different tracts and things speaking against the Manichaeans, but there's a real dicey issue here that most people don't understand, is that by the time you end up in the 5th or 6th century, Platonism is being shut down entirely throughout the world as a heresy. What happens by the time you end towards the end of the Middle Ages, they're rediscovering a lot of these writings, and the one writing that sort of messes everything up is St. Augustine refers to Platonism as the next closest thing to Christianity, where it